So front row, we provide insurance and risk management consulting services for the entertainment industry. In case you're not aware of what we do yet, we operate out of 7 offices across Canada and the U.S. Our senior account executives have over 20 years of experience providing expertise wherever and whenever needed. Front row specializes in providing insurance solutions for a number of sectors, including the sectors that you see listed on the slide here. Of course, we will be talking primarily about the photography sector here today, but we also do a lot of film production work and other areas of the entertainment industry. So my name is Grant. I'm VP of Marketing here at Front Row. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. I have about 8 years experience in the insurance industry in marketing communications roles, and I joined Front Row in 2019. I'm a graduate of Ryerson and the University of Toronto. David McLeish, account executive in the Front Row Insurance Vancouver office, is a general level 2 licensed insurance broker. He joined the Front Row team in 2018. Prior to that, he was a senior insurance advisor at BCAA selling home and travel insurance. David has a BA from Simon Fraser, a BFA from Emily Carr in photography, and an MA from Trent University. David is excited to be bringing together his passion for the arts and his passion for insurance. He's also an avid gardener and volunteers with Vancouver's Green Streets program. Here is just an overview of the structure of today's webinar, and we'll just explain a couple basic things about GoToWebinar. We'll get into some disclaimers that we have to say. We will talk about the whole pandemic situation that we're unfortunately still in right now and how that relates to photography insurance. And then David will get into explaining a lot of interesting things about photography insurance that perhaps you don't know yet.
Okay, thanks Grant, thanks for that. So I'm going to start with this general disclaimer. I'll just read this one out. So the information provided herein is to be used as general reference only and is not intended as advice for any particular situation. In all cases, actual coverage is subject to policy language, terms, and conditions of the policy documents issued by the insurance company. Any pricing, premiums, rates, deductibles, exclusions, information mentioned in this webinar is correct as of March 25th, 2021, but is subject to change without notice and cannot be relied upon as accurate. Please refer to your current policy wording. So just a bit of legalese there. But that leads us to our second disclaimer. Okay, next slide, please. Here we go. The controls are a little bit delayed for me. Sorry about that. So disclaimer part 2 is about the hard market. So, the insurance industry is changing all the time, but right now it's undergoing some really massive changes. And that's partly because we're in what's called a hard market. The last time we were in a hard market was in 2002, 2003, and it was partly due to the terrorist attacks in New York after 9/11. So, this short period of time when insurance goes through hard market conditions, but right now we're in those conditions and they're expected to last until about 2022. The contributing factors this time are obviously COVID is a big one, but we had a lot of hurricanes, a lot of wildfires in Australia and California, the big Texas snowstorm. So all of these things sort of contributing to hard market conditions right now. So the effects of a hard market are basically that insurance companies start limiting their exposure, limiting their capacity, which means there's less competition in the insurance market, broadly speaking, which means there's increasing rates, stricter terms and conditions. So kind of Wild West right now. So part 2 of the disclaimer, because the things that I say in this presentation in a year from now could be drastically different. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this presentation, which leads us right into COVID. Let's get this over with because everybody has questions about COVID and how it relates to their insurance. So let's talk about that. So at this point, all policies now have some form of communicable disease exclusion on them. It's similar to the terrorism exclusions that you see on all insurance policies now that were introduced since the 9/11 attack. So, the expectation is that these communicable disease exclusions are just going to be like the terrorism exclusion. They're just going to be on all insurance policies for the foreseeable future. So it's just, the new insurance reality. But I guess the question is, well, how does that affect your photography insurance? So most photographers' policies are going to have two components. There's going to be property damage coverage and legal liability coverage. So for a property damage claim to be triggered, there needs to be direct physical loss or damage to property. And it's hard to understand or think about how a communicable disease or a virus exclusion could relate to this, because how would a virus cause direct physical damage to property? And it's worth noting that right now insurance companies are in court arguing that viruses do not cause direct physical damage, because some people are claiming that contaminated surfaces are physical damage, and they're trying to make claims through their insurance because of this. And so this, it's contentious, it's in court. But for property damage, generally speaking, for most photographers, this COVID exclusion or this communicable disease exclusion is not really going to have any bearing on your coverage. And some people have asked me, like, well, what if I had COVID when I dropped my camera, or when, what if the thief that stole my camera had COVID? Like, is the coverage going to be excluded? And the answer is no. I mean, it's, probably not. It's hard to draw that connection, right? And then the other coverage is legal liability. So in this case, claims get triggered by a lawsuit that's brought against you for bodily injury or property damage. So in order for this to be triggered, a claimant would have to sue you or your business, claiming that a COVID-related injury or death was caused by your business's negligence. And how they would prove that in court is really hard to even imagine when you're in a pandemic and COVID is everywhere. But at this point, even if that happened, all policies have this communicable disease exclusion. So, coverage is excluded. You won't have coverage if someone tries to sue you for getting COVID. I'm sorry. But the chances of that ever happening is sort of slim to none. So, COVID and photographer's insurance, the sort of conclusion that we're drawing is that it's not really helpful or harmful. These new exclusions doesn't really impact your coverage one way or the other. So it's there, it's like the terrorism exclusion, but it's not really going to change the way the insurance responds. So you might be wondering, well, what are all of these COVID claims then that are driving up the rates and creating these hard market conditions? So, what would be excluded, I guess, is the question. And so there's lots of, claims for life insurance, but the big one is event cancellation. So, Wimbledon famously made an event cancellation claim for COVID. I think the Tokyo Olympics had a COVID claim. And there's also business interruption claims. So I do sometimes get this question. We don't have business interruption on our photographers' policies, and probably most photographers' policies won't have it, because business interruption is a coverage related to brick and mortar operations. So there has to be direct physical damage to the building itself in order for this coverage to be triggered. And so it's likely that you wouldn't even have business interruption on your policy. And, because there was no direct physical damage to most of these businesses that are claiming for business interruption losses right now, the insurance companies are often denying these claims, or they're contesting these claims in court. So, those are the areas where COVID is really having an impact in the insurance industry, mainly life insurance, event cancellation, and business interruption claims. But none of these really have any bearing on the insurance that is available to photographers. So that's as much as I have to say about COVID, but I'm sure there's going to be more questions about that. So feel free to ask. Sorry about the controls, guys. Okay. So the sort of broad contours of the rest of this presentation was designed around the idea of like the life cycle of applying for insurance, and then having insurance, and then finally making a claim. Everyone's favorite topic. So it's sort of based on like questions that I get a lot, which has good and bad aspects. It means that we're going to cover like a broad swath of territory, and not everything is necessarily going to be relevant to you or your business operations. But there are questions that do come up all the time, and so obviously like they're not clear. People don't really understand these. So that's sort of where we're going to go. We're going to start with applying for the insurance, and then once you have the insurance, what you do with it, and then when you have to make a claim, How is that all going to go? So equipment considerations. When you're first applying for insurance, some insurance companies do ask for a list of equipment, but others offer coverage on a blanket basis. So if it's a blanket basis, then you're not required to provide a list of equipment. So that I get this question a lot. Do I need to provide you with a list of equipment when I'm applying for the insurance? It depends on the policy. Our policies are blanket basis, so all you need to do is, have a total number that represents the replacement cost value of all of the equipment you own, and then ensure that value. But it is prudent to keep an inventory, even though you're not required to, just for your own records, and it does come up if you have to make a claim. So we'll come back to that. But even if you're not required to provide the insurance company with a list of equipment, it's a good idea to keep an Excel with your make, model, serial numbers, all of that. So proof of ownership, often get this because lots of people buy cameras secondhand, or they don't have their receipts from 10 years ago when they bought the camera or whatever. So they say, well, how do I prove that I've owned this? So the short answer is yes. Depending on the claim, you may need to provide proof of ownership. I mean, if you physically have the camera in your hands, it's just cracked, then they may not ask to see an original receipt. But if it's been stolen or it's been dropped to the bottom of the ocean, you might have to prove that you did own this equipment. There's nothing in the policy that defines what proof of ownership is. It's really like, does it pass the smell test? So the only advice I can give you is the original receipts are the ideal, and everything else is less than ideal. But obviously, claims adjusters have seen it all. So just keep your receipts. Keep your receipts. Take photos of your equipment. Keep an Excel. I mean, do what you need to do to prove that in the event that you lose this equipment, that you did own it at some point, and you can pass that smell test. What not to include in your list of equipment. So, what to include. Everything related to your business operations. So this would be worst case scenario. Everything goes up in smoke. You have to replace everything. So what's it going to cost you to replace all of your equipment, all of your bags, your tripods, your lenses, your lens caps, everything. And what we're ensuring is the replacement cost value. So the insurance company is going to reimburse you to replace all of these items. So you want to include the cost of those items today, what it's going to cost you to replace them. Taxes is a bit of a tricky one. So if you can claim the insurance or the taxes back on your income taxes as a business expense, then the insurance company won't include taxes in their replacement cost. But if you can't claim those back, then they will include the taxes. So the idea here is they don't want you to be double dipping, getting the taxes paid for, but then getting them reimbursed on your income tax. So whether or not to include the taxes depends on how your business is set up and whether or not you can claim them as business expenses. What not to include in your equipment. So property belonging to others. I mean, this should be sort of obvious, but I have, been in situations where sort of like a co-op collective, like everybody kind of owns everybody else's equipment and they share it. And, so it should be pretty clear who owns what. So only your own property. Don't include personal items because this is a business insurance policy. So, like your Xbox is not going to be part of your business operations or clothing. Cell phones. So our policy has a very specific cell phone exclusion because it's not intended to cover personal property. So I wouldn't include cell phones in your list of equipment. If you're like an Instagram influencer, I'm sorry, but our policies don't cover cell phones. Drones. So drones are considered aircraft and they require their own type of insurance policy. There are a lot of people who think that drones are covered under the policy when they're not. So if you do need coverage for drones, let us know because we need to apply for a separate policy. So don't include that under your list of equipment. And then business property related to other operations other than photography. So, if you're one of these, like, I'm a half pet photographer, half pet groomer, like don't include the pet grooming tools and equipment in your list of photography equipment because that's not going to be covered by a photographer's policy. So if you do have sort of these like split half and half operations, you've got to talk to a broker and make sure that you have a policy that's going to contemplate all of those. Because if you're just applying through the website, they're not going to just assume that like, hey, we're also going to cover like pet clippers and leashes and collars. That's just not going to be part of the coverage. Equipment that requires additional underwriting approval. So if you do any underwater photography or photography on or in water, you'll need to get that specifically approved. So they'll want to know information about the type of housing you're using, your level of experience, how deep you dive. If you're shooting on water, like if you're in a kayak and you're taking your camera equipment on a kayak, then they might have some additional questions. They might want to know that you're using a tether or that you've got your equipment in a waterproof case. Any equipment that's attached to an aircraft or vehicle requires special underwriting authorization. And there's just sort of a general catch-all equipment used during hazardous activities like rock climbing or zip lining. So again, there's no definition of hazardous activities. It's meant to be vague because, photographers can dream up all kinds of crazy things to do with their equipment. So, if it's sort of outside of the ordinary of what you would do with your camera equipment, then best to talk to a broker and, see if this requires any kind of additional authorization, because the insurance company might say that they didn't sign up for this, they didn't, so always check with your broker if it's anything sort of hazardous. And then camera equipment with video only capability. So this is new to us. So we can cover cameras that do both. But if it's like a video specific camera, then, a still photographer's policy is not the right policy for you, and you've got to look at getting a different type of policy. Specialized equipment that does not require approval. Matterport 3D, do like interior photography or real estate listings, or upright photo booths that are not in closed rooms. So if you're like a wedding photographer or event photographer and you've got one of those cameras or the photo booths that just stand, that's fine, as long as it's not like an actual room photo booth, like the old-timey one that you would climb into and you get the 4 headshots. Like inflatable rooms are okay, but those like actual physical rooms are not okay. And then the photo booth, the upright photo booth, must not be left unattended. So you can't just leave the photo booth at the event and say, here's how you operate it, have at it, and then come back and it's destroyed and make an insurance claim. That wouldn't be covered. But big disclaimer, this information is subject to change. Check with your broker. So, these are things that have come up over the years of us having this insurance policy, and we've had to check with the underwriters, and, these things have been approved at this point. But like I said, subject to change, hard market, etc. So newly acquired equipment, sometimes get this question, can I add equipment to the policy midterm? Yes, you can add equipment to the policy after it's been purchased, but there might be change fees that apply. So, if you're going to be acquiring equipment soon, it might be prudent to just include it at inception, give yourself a little bit of a buffer room so that you can add and sell equipment throughout the year and not have to constantly make adjustments. So, generally, like, don't put your equipment limit as an exact number to the dollar. Round it up to the nearest 1,000 or 500, and it's the difference in the premium is going to be next to nothing. So it's better to do that than to have to pay midterm to make little adjustments to your policy. Applying for insurance. Who is insured? So we're still at the application phase. So the applicant, when you're applying for insurance is kind of like a mortgage. It's very similar to the mortgage industry in some ways. So when you apply for insurance, you have to apply for insurance, first of all. You can be declined, so you might not get all the limits that you want. So you want this policy to be set up correctly at the beginning. So when you apply for insurance, that applicant gets put onto the policy as the named insured, which is a technical term in insurance. So the named insured has certain rights and duties that are defined by the policy. So they have the duty to pay the insurance premium. They have the right to make changes to the policy. They have the right to cancel the policy. They're also the ones that insurance claims are paid out to. So the named insured needs to be the owner of the equipment that's being insured under the policy. Needs to be the one signing the contract. If you have a contract that obligates you to carry insurance, then the name on the insurance needs to match the name on the contract. So I get this question sometimes because, I've seen lots of different types of, like, people will sometimes put their website as the named insured on the policy. Don't do that. So, depending on how your business is set up, will determine who to put as the named insured on the policy. So if you're a corporation, it's really simple. You just put your corporation's name. If you're a sole proprietorship, if you're registered or not, it's going to be your legal name. If you're a partnership, you name all the partners. If you're a trade names, I don't believe, can enter into contracts, and you would put your legal name and then doing business as your trade name. So if you're not sure, the next slide. If you're not sure who to put as the named insured, ask yourself, can this thing sign a contract? Can it deposit a check? Can it own property? So I've had situations where, someone's made a claim, it's been adjusted, they write a check to the person, and then they get the check, and they're like, I can't deposit this check because there's no bank account in the name of, this thing that my insurance is under. So you want to make sure that, whatever you're putting down as the named insured on your policy is able to cash a check. Yeah. Next slide, please. There we go. Who is an insured? So this is sort of related to who's an insured. And I get this question a lot from wedding photographers who have second shooters and they say, is my second shooter covered? So the answer is coverage may extend to second shooters. So the reason I say may is because in the policy, there's no second shooter coverage. There's no definition of a second shooter. This is a very specific term in the photo industry. So an insurance policy is not going to have any verbiage around second shooters. What they're going to have language around is employees. And employees of a company are insured under a company's policy, but they're only insured during the scope of their employment duties. So if you hire a second shooter, you should really have a contract with that person that spells out the terms of their employment. And if you want advice on that, you need to talk to a lawyer. We're not lawyers, but it's a really good idea to have an employment contract with the second shooter that spells out what their duties are, that they're an employee of your operations, and that way there's no ambiguity as to whether or not they're an employee. But again, only insured during the scope of their employment duties. So, if your second shooter works for you for a day and then goes off and does their own gig the next day, at that point, they're no longer covered by your policy. They would need to have their own policy to cover their own duties or, other shoots that they take on. Also, their equipment is not going to be covered by your policy. If you hire a second shooter that comes with their own equipment, they need to have their own insurance policy to insure their equipment. You could get around this with my little unless the first shooter paid to rent the equipment, and there's a rental agreement in place that establishes that the first shooter is liable for the damage to the equipment, then you could technically cover the second shooter's equipment under your policy as rented equipment. There would have to be a very clear rental agreement between you and the second shooter that makes you liable for damage to their equipment. And probably you don't have that, so it's probably just easier to tell the second shooter your equipment is not covered and not rent the equipment from the second shooter, and just leave it at that. And then also, second shooters are not going to be covered for bodily injury while they're on the job. So sometimes people do get confused about the difference between workers' compensation and an insurance policy. So an on-the-job injury would be considered a workers' compensation claim, and there you'd have to have workers' compensation to cover that kind of an injury. That leads to the next slide. So bodily injury to yourself and your employees is not covered by commercial insurance. That's something that you'd want to talk to a life insurance agent about, or workers' compensation. So just keep that in mind. Additional insured. So again, who is insured by the policy? Who and what are additional insured? So additional insured and lost payees, these are two different ways that different entities could be added to your policy. So an additional insured would maybe be a municipality or a park or a government agency granting a permit. It might be a venue where you're working or you're renting out space. Sometimes it could be a client that you're working for. And then lost payees are equipment rental houses or a long-term leasing company if you have a lease-to-own agreement for some of your camera equipment. So what these do, so an additional insured, they're related to two different parts of your coverage. Additional insured is related to the legal liability on your policy. So this would be an entity that could possibly be named in a lawsuit brought against or brought about by your business activities. So, you know, if you're filming at or shooting at a park, you need to apply for a permit. The permit agency wants to make sure that you have insurance, and they ask to be added as an additional insured, because if you cause bodily injury to somebody while you're at the park, they'll sue you, but they'll also sue the park for letting you be there in the first place. So they want to make sure that if that ever happens, that it's your insurance that's going to respond to defend the park in court or pay any damages that are awarded against them in court. So adding additional insured to your policy means that they're also insured by your policy, and it affords those additional insureds the same coverage and limits as you are afforded under the policy. A lost payee is slightly different. It relates to property damage claims. And these are entities that have a financial interest in equipment. So usually it's going to be a rental house that will want to be added as a lost payee, or, like I said, a long-term leasing company. So when you add a lost payee to the policy, it means that the insurance company, when they pay out the claim, they can pay it directly to the lost payee rather than paying it to you, the named insured, and then having you then reimburse the rental company for the losses. So if they weren't added as a lost payee, the insurance company would have no mechanism for writing that check to the rental house. They would have to write the check to you, and then you would have to give the money back to the rental house. The rental house doesn't want to have to go through that. They want the check made out to them, but they're going to ask to be added as a lost payee. Adding additional insureds and lost payees. We get this question all the time, because that's often the first time when a photographer realizes that they need insurance. It's not just something that they think about that they maybe would like to have one day. It's like, you can't do this until you prove that you have insurance and you add me as an additional insured or a lost payee. And then people come to our door and they're like, I need to do this. How do I do it? What does this mean? So there's lots of information that we provided. We give you a blank certificate that you can use to add additional insureds and lost payees to your policy. There's instructions, step-by-step instructions. There's a YouTube tutorial. There's FAQs. There's explainers. It's so easy. It's like we made it as easy as possible. But we still get that question a lot because it's, you know, it's kind of arcane. Can I issue a certificate to anyone? I mean, if we give you this blank certificate, can you just start sort of do like an insurance factory, just giving insurance to everybody? And the answer is no, you cannot issue a certificate to just anyone. So there's certain people that you cannot issue a certificate to. Aircraft owner operators. So obviously you can't, because the policy itself doesn't cover aircraft. So you can't issue a certificate to a drone operator because it doesn't cover drones. It doesn't cover aircraft liability. You also can't issue a certificate to special effects, pyrotechnic companies, stunt coordinators, and again, this sort of catch-all hazardous activities. So helicopters, watercraft, railroad, precision driving, animals. Like the idea is that you can't extend the risk to the insurance company beyond what they had initially contemplated when they wrote the policy. So if you do get asked to add someone as an additional insured who operates a helicopter company or a railroad, chances are you can't issue that certificate and you would have to get underwriting authorization. But fortunately, that doesn't really come up very often with photographers. Entities that may require custom certificates. So we give you this blank, but sometimes companies want to see their own wording or a special form. So leasing companies have their own forms that they want filled out. Some municipalities, like the city of Vancouver, they have their own form. Some rental houses, sometimes U.S. entities want to see a different type of form. So if they don't tell you up front, and try using the blank certificate first, and if it gets rejected, then contact us and we can create a custom certificate if you don't know. But sometimes they'll just say, no, you have to fill out this form, and then that's when you contact us and we'll fill it out for you and sign it. Okay, making a claim. Everyone's favorite topic, and what to expect. So these are the questions that I get all the time. So someone calls, they've had something happen. First thing they want to know is it covered? The next thing they want to know is how fast will my claim get paid? They may not be so interested in what supporting documentation they need to provide, but it's good to know. And then they're also very concerned about how is this going to impact my premium. So let's talk about all four of those things. So is it covered? Don't ask me, I'm just the broker. So we are the intermediary between you and the insurance company that actually ends up paying the claim. So we don't decide whether or not a loss is covered or not covered. That's up to the claims adjuster. So we don't even have the authority to say that it's covered or not covered. So, I mean, don't ask us, we're just the broker. But the determination of coverage exclusions is made by the claims adjuster. Read your policy wording. It's only 190 pages long. So I'm saying that not to be flippant, but because like even the claims adjuster might not know if it's covered right away on the phone. I mean, they have to read through the policy wording. They have to look at the events. They need to review the supporting documentation. So the point is, adjusting a claim is a process. They're not going to be able to give you that answer right away. So just hunker down, strap in, and just go through the motions, right? Don't expect that you're going to be told over the phone that don't worry, everything's covered. It's a process. So, but I guess that's not very reassuring. So I thought I would include some information about the types of claims that are covered. So what is the number one claim on photographers? And when I say number one claim, I don't mean to imply that there's some sort of report that's generated of like the top 10 photographers' claims. This is based on my totally subjective and in no way scientific experience of reporting claims to the insurance company. But can anyone guess what the number one claim is? It is dropped camera or some variation of that. Tripod fell over, slipped while holding camera fell off the table, camera fell out of the bag, camera fell in the ocean. That's the number one claim. As far as I can tell, it's like, oops, I slipped, my camera doesn't work anymore. So, and that's followed up closely by the number two claim, which is camera got wet. Like, a little bit of salt water splashed up on my camera, now it doesn't work. Or like I dropped some coffee. So there's no dropped camera exclusion on the policy. There's no water exclusion on the policy. So, and then number three, theft. Some people do ask, like, is theft covered? Short answer is yes. Long answer is yes, but there are conditions. So what is not covered? Well, there's lots of exclusions, unfortunately. So read your policy wording. We do provide you the policy wording before you purchase the policy, even if you want to review it. But the most common things that people call in and want to make a claim for that aren't going to be covered are things like mechanical breakdowns. So like, my camera just stopped working. I don't know why. It doesn't work anymore. That's not going to be covered. Latent defect and wear and tear are not covered. And then drones, and sadly, we get a lot of people calling and saying like, oh, I lost my drone. And I have to tell them, well, you don't have a drone policy. So, yeah. Lots of exclusions. Next slide, please. Oops. I already skipped the slide there. Okay, how fast will my claim be paid? So I know this is really important to photographers because, you know, it's your livelihood. You might have a gig that you need to work on. So how fast is it going to be paid? It really depends. And it's partly on you. You know, depends on the nature of the claim. If the adjuster going to need a repair estimate, they have the option of repairing or replacing equipment. So they might ask to see what they're going to cost to repair this camera. So you might need to send the camera to get a repair estimate to provide that documentation. You might need to provide a police report or photographs. So my advice here is pay attention to what the adjuster is asking you for, because they'll let you know, but then once they've told you this is what I need, they're not going to like follow up and chase you down for that information. They're busy people. So, you know, provide them with all of the documentation that they ask for, and your claim will get adjusted quicker. Other things to bear in mind, just sort of harsh realities. I mean, I don't mean to be, this is just a frank discussion, but this is commercial insurance. So this is not home insurance where, you know, if there's a fire, people are like out on the street, they don't have anywhere to live. Like, this is business insurance. So operates Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, statutory holidays. There's time zones to keep in mind. So, you know, that's just the reality. So generally 2 to 3 weeks from start to finish of a claim, but it can take up to 1 to 2 months. And again, like if it takes, you know, 1 to 2 months, that's probably because there's supporting documentation that you need to acquire or that the adjuster is waiting on. That's not typical, but, you know, 2 to 3 weeks turnaround time is pretty typical. Just to be aware of, right? They're not going to cut you the check the next day so you can go buy a new camera. Yeah. So supporting documentation, what supporting documentation do you need to provide? It's going to be specific to the type of loss. So like I said, you might need to provide them with a repair estimate. If it's damage to rented equipment, they're going to want to see the rental contract that spells out the terms of the contract, so what you're actually liable for. You might need to provide proof of ownership if it's stolen. And again, you know, what that looks like will depend, but ideally it's going to be your original receipts or like a credit card statement or something like that. Police reports are going to be required if there was a crime committed, even if it's out of country. And then replacement invoices. So the policy is a replacement cost basis, so they need proof that you've actually replaced the equipment. So you'll need to replace it and then provide them with the invoices that prove that you've actually replaced the equipment. So this, you know, some people get nervous about this because, like, if you've got $20,000, $50,000 in camera equipment that's insured, you might not have access to $20,000 or $50,000 to replace it and then get reimbursed. So in some cases like that, the insurance company might settle initially on an actual cash value basis, and then once you provide proof that you've replaced the equipment, then they'll reimburse the difference between actual cash value and replacement cost. So they'll front you cash to buy some new equipment, and then they'll start reimbursing you. And then theft from an unattended vehicle. So this is sort of a special type of loss, and there's special conditions. So if your equipment is stolen from an unattended vehicle, there has to be visible signs of forced entry into the vehicle. It's sometimes called a locked vehicle warranty. It just means that you didn't just leave the car unlocked and someone came along and opened the door and took the equipment. They had to force their way in to steal your equipment. So if this does happen to you, one of the supporting documents that you'll need to provide is visible signs of forced entry into the vehicle. To take photos of the smashed window or the scratches around the lock or the handle on the car. And a different deductible may apply. So I say may, again, hard market, changing all the time. Currently, our theft from an unattended vehicle is deductible is $2,500. Subject to change. But it is covered. It's just with these extra conditions. So higher deductible, and then 3% times of forced entry into the vehicle. So some people think that it's just not covered at all. For us, it is. But, some insurance policies do just completely exclude theft from an unattended vehicle. And that's because, obviously, it happens all the time. So best advice is don't leave your equipment in an unattended vehicle if you can help it. Or be really careful about, loading and unloading your gear from your car. You scope it out. They see you walking around with all this expensive camera equipment, and then they wait until you walk back to your car. They figure out where your car is. So they're very clever. It happens all the time, and that's why insurance policies respond with these extra conditions or these exclusions. So best to be prudent and avoid that situation if you can. How will a claim impact my premium? I get this question a lot. So again, vague answer. I'm sorry. It depends. Market conditions, it's changing all the time. So doing this kind of cost-benefit analysis is really difficult. Some people want to say like, oh, well, my deductible is $350 and it's going to cost me this much to replace the equipment. And so, like, if my insurance premiums go up by this much over this many years, like, is it still going to be worth my while to, like, you can't really do that because the rates could be completely different a year from now than they are right now. And the terms could be totally different. So, you can't really game it out that way in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. And then the other problem is that, the impact could depend on whether or not you make another claim after this claim. So those are not necessarily the best things to be considering when you're deciding whether or not to go forward with a claim. So some things you do know for certain. If you do make a claim, your rates are going to increase. There is no one claim forgiveness on commercial insurance policies. And insurance companies look at your loss history from the past 3 to 5 years. So whatever impact this claim is going to have, it's going to have that impact for the next 3 to 5 years, depending on the insurance company. So those are things we know for certain. These are things we can reasonably expect. We're in a hard market, again, I keep coming back to this, but so rates are going to go up, and it's going to be even harder to get insured if you've got claims on your history. The special terms and conditions that the insurance company imposes are going to relate to the type of loss. So, if you have a theft claim, they might impose a special theft deductible. They're not going to increase your liability premiums or vice versa. If you have a liability loss, they're not necessarily going to start putting high deductibles on your equipment because it's not related. We also know that some insurance companies have certain thresholds. So if your prior losses exceed a certain amount, then you just won't be eligible for coverage with them. And then underwriters look at both severity and frequency. So, if you make lots of little claims, that could be just as bad as if you have like 1 or 2 massive claims on your claims history. So they don't want to see someone that's constantly making little nuisance claims for like $500 or $600 because that costs them a lot of money to insure. Just sort of the administration side of that. And then reasonably expect some insurance companies will decline applicants with significant losses. So especially in the hard market, it's becoming really challenging to find insurance for people that have significant loss histories because there's like not as much competition. There's not as much insurance companies available. So maybe a year and a half ago in the entertainment world, there were 5 insurance companies that were offering coverage, and now we're down to about 3. So, the number of companies that we can even go to is narrowing. And the reality is that, some people are just getting like outright declined because of their loss history. So when you're deciding whether or not to make a claim, some things you might want to consider are, is this something that you can afford to cover yourself? Like, is this a catastrophic loss where you just do not have the financial means to cover this, like $20,000? Or, is it a cracked lens that's $700? And if you budgeted for your dropped camera losses, then you could technically cover that under your operational costs. Another thing to consider is, do you need this insurance to operate? So do you need to provide certificates to get permits to shoot at parks or to rent out equipment. I mean, if you don't have insurance, then is that going to significantly impact your ability to operate your business? So, you know, you may want to consider, like, is it worth jeopardizing having that opportunity, that access to that insurance to cover a loss that, you know, would be painful, but you could probably pay for it yourself? And then another thing to bear in mind is that you can withdraw a claim after you've reported the loss. So just talking to the claims adjuster won't impact your loss history, as in, you know, you might decide at the end of the day that it's not worth it and then just cover the loss yourself. So there's no risk in talking to the adjuster and then finding out, you know, whether or not it would be covered in the first place. So this is sort of just broad strokes of understanding insurance. You know, insurance is not intended to be a maintenance contract. Like, you know, a maintenance contract, one you're probably most familiar with is like an elevator maintenance contract where you hire a company, and if your elevator breaks down, then they come and they fix it, and then you replace spare parts, and they keep it in good working order. That's not really what insurance is intended to do. It's intended for catastrophic losses. So, you know, losses that you couldn't possibly budget for that would completely bankrupt you if you had to cover them yourself. Something else to sort of be aware of is that miscellaneous equipment, which is what all of your camera gear is considered to the insurance industry, is what they call a loss leader, which means that, like, remember the dropped camera claim or camera got wet claim? Like, it gets damaged all the time. So most insurance companies don't like it, and they are not interested in it, and they won't offer coverage on a standalone basis. So this is sort of my, like, TED Talk moment of, like, you know, maybe the greatest fear is, like, not becoming the person you really are. Like, you know, maybe the reason that you have the insurance is not to protect you, but to protect others from you. You know, and we're dealing with, like, a film company. Like, when they get the insurance, they get it so that they can get those location permits. They can rent that equipment. It's not really about covering their own financial interests. It's making sure that the people that they work with have that protection if their operations cause them some sort of loss. So they're rethinking, like, what is this insurance for? For photographers, and you're usually like a lone wolf kind of operation. So you think of the insurance as like protecting you, but it's also a tool. It's like a financial tool that opens certain doors for you. So it allows you to rent equipment, to have lease equipment, to get permits. So if you think about the insurance in those terms, then, you know, it might help you when you're deciding whether or not it's worth taking a claim for this $1,000 lens that you cracked. But again, caveat, catastrophic is relative. Like, I totally understand we're in a pandemic and finances are tight, and, like, having to pay $1,000 to replace a lens could be totally catastrophic to you. Like, yes, that's fair. So go ahead and make that claim. Like, it's totally a personal financial decision. Just, you know, there's lots of things to bear in mind if you're needing to make a claim. So, what? You didn't think there was going to be an ad in this presentation? Hey, front row insurance. So I just put this in here because, like, as bleak as it seems, like, there is really good coverage available at low cost. There's low deductibles, worldwide territory, replacement cost basis. So as bad as, like, insurance seems, it's sort of miraculous that there are these policies that are as affordable and as good coverage as we have available. So it's, you know, not all doom and gloom. Just wanted to end on a positive note, but there's a little caveat right at the bottom. Subject to change without notice, cannot be relied upon as accurate. So, you know, everything with a grain of salt, but it's not all doom and gloom. So I think that's the end of my presentation. Grant, I can go on to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, David. So we have this ebook, Photography Insurance and Protecting Your Camera Gear, available on our site at the URL that you see on this slide. The ebook overlaps with some of the content that David delivered on the webinar, but it also includes a lot of additional information that we weren't able to get to on today's webinar. So the PDF is certainly worth a download if you go to that webpage on the slide. And I understand that many attendees on this webinar are probably already customers of Front Row's photography insurance program, but in case you're not yet, there is a coupon code on Front Row's photography insurance program, specifically for PPOC members. You can see that coupon code highlighted on the slide here. You can get to the photography site at photographer.frontrowinsurance.com, and you can enter that code into the portal for 50 off. But note that the coupon is valid in Canada only. Quebec, Ontario, Saskatchewan provinces are excluded for insurance regulatory reasons. So to get to some questions, Manpreet asks, what if I use iPads for my shoot? What about computers and hard drives?
Yeah, I mean, computers, hard drives would be considered equipment. I mean, obviously, every photographer now uses some sort of computer or software to edit their images. So just include that in your equipment limit. And an iPad, yeah, I mean, sure. It would be like a laptop, I guess. There's not, there isn't going to be a specific wording about iPad in that sense. It's too specific. So,
yeah.
But if you use it for your photography, then include it in your equipment limit.
Okay, David, I'm not sure if it's because you're putting your hand near the headset, but your voice is coming through really muffled sometimes. It's a little bit late to fix it now, but if you could maybe try. It sounds okay now. Yeah. Another question. Yeah, another question from Jackie. If my staff's equipment gets wrecked at a studio job, what does that look like? Is it covered?
So I'm not sure. I mean, the question to me sounds like it actually happened. So I don't really know because I don't know the details. But is there any way you could do more? I'm not quite sure how to answer that question because it sounds like it's a very, very specific question, and in those instances, you need to talk to the claims adjuster. Yeah, but maybe if you could do a follow-up question, I could try to answer that.
No, that's fine. That's fair enough. Desiree asks, can we use our cameras for personal use, like if we are on vacation?
Yes. Yeah. So the policy, it allows for non-professionals, and if it's equipment that you do use professionally, but at the time of the loss, it's not on a job, they're not gonna ask were you actually working when you dropped this camera? That just won't come up. So there are questions on the application about whether or not you generate revenue, but even if you don't generate any revenue, if you're just amateur photographer just for pleasure, you can get one of our policies. And yeah, so it wouldn't make any difference if you're not working when it happens.
Okay, Vanessa has a comment here. It's kind of lengthy, so I'll just read it out here. A photographer friend of mine who has Front Row insurance lost all her equipment in a house fire. When she was making her claim, at first they said her camera bag, light stands, and backdrops would not be covered, that they were props. She had to fight to get them to see those items as accessories, and finally they did get covered. I was really surprised to hear this given you market to photographers. Why would a camera bag not be part of any package?
Yeah, well, I mean, can't speak to the specific claim, but from what I understand from your question, ultimately they were covered. So I think that situation is just, there was a confusion, which does happen. So one thing to remember is that claims adjusters they're not necessarily specialists in photography or even you know, like they could be independent third-party adjusters of the insurance company contracts to adjust the claim. So they might not necessarily be familiar with the policy wording. So they might misinterpret how the wording reads. And, you know, you may need to, like, that's where a broker can help you, is if there's some disagreement about whether or not something is covered or not covered, we can, you know, talk to the underwriters in the policy, we can talk to the claims adjuster, we can help them understand the wording, because they're not necessarily, like, they don't know the policy wording like the back of their hand. So, you know, to me, from what I understand from your question, it just sounds like the claims adjuster was confused initially, and then ultimately it got worked out. But, you know, as far as I am aware, a camera bag would be considered camera equipment, and you should include it in your equipment limit. And if you have to explain that to a claims adjuster, then so be it.
Okay. So Manpreet has a question. If damage or loss happens out of country, is that covered?
Well, that is going to depend. So, I mean, on our policy, you have the option of choosing your territorial limit. So you can choose either Canada, US only coverage or worldwide coverage. So it'll depend. If it's worldwide, then yes. Canada, US only, then, you know, not outside of that territory. Even with worldwide coverage, there's going to be limitations. So there's certain countries that are going to be explicitly excluded, like Syria and Iraq and Sudan, North Korea. There's also going to be sanctions that you may need to be aware of if you're like a war photographer. You know, there are certain countries that the insurance company is legally not allowed to operate in. So you'd have to check, you know, the latest government sanctions, because those change all the time. So all that the policy will say is, you know, we'll provide coverage as far as we can legally, but, you know, they're not going to breach an economic or trade sanction so that they can pay out your claim. So short answer is, yeah, it depends on the territory that you choose initially.
Great. Okay, that's all we have for the questions. And that brings us to the end of our webinar. So if you have additional questions, feedback, or if we didn't have time to fully answer a question here, feel free to email the Vancouver office. If you're in BC and Western Canada, you see the email on the slide here. Toronto office and Eastern provinces, email is on the slide here, and Montreal as well. If you're in another area, you can go to our Contact Us page to get the relevant email. Also, feel free to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and/or Twitter. We do keep those channels regularly up to date, and we would appreciate a follow. So thanks to David, of course, for an informative presentation. And thanks to the PPOC for partnering with us on today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded, and a YouTube link to the recording will be made available on the PPOC members website. Assuming the feedback on this webinar is positive, we may do more webinars in partnership with PPOC in the future, so be on the lookout for those. So thanks for listening, everyone, and have a good day. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.